Even to this day, I cannot forget her eyes and the expression on her face, eyes filled with hatred, yet with an expression that seemed to show satisfaction when I forced myself upon her during the Vietnam War. And only much later did I understand that the moment I abandoned the last piece of my morality was the moment the noose of regret and self-condemnation slipped around my neck. I have lived ever since with this torment, this restless ache for the wrong I committed, ashamed that I once let go of my decency and became a despicable man. And above all, I know there is a child out there, my child, whom I have never and perhaps will never see. The words I've just spoken are not a confession I plan to make. They are not a neatly written statement from a courtroom, nor the lines of a movie script. They are the truth, raw, unpolished, and heavy like a stone that has been lodged in my chest for half a century. People like to believe that when a war ends, its participants can simply pack up their uniforms, step onto a plane, and fly back into a peaceful life. They think you can wash the blood off your hands, hang your medals on the wall, and pick up where you left off. That is a comforting story, and it might be true for some. But for me, the war never ended. It just changed shape. The battles moved from the jungles of Vietnam into the quiet of my own head, where no one could see them, except me. I can still hear the rain from that night, hammering on the tin roofs, mixing with the distant rumble of artillery. My boots were soaked, my rifle heavy. The air smelled of mud, gunpowder, and fear. I was 24 years old, a stranger in a strange land, wearing the uniform of the United States Army and carrying more responsibility than I was ever prepared for. Back then, I told myself I was just doing my job, following orders, keeping my men alive, completing the mission. That was the lie I lived by. Because the truth is, war has a way of stripping away your excuses until you're left face to face with the person you really are. And sometimes, that person is not someone you can live with. It's hard to explain the slow erosion of morality in a war zone. It doesn't happen in one day. It's not like a light switch flipping from good to evil. It's more like a rope slowly fraying fiber by fiber until it snaps. You see things, you do things, and you start to believe the rules don't apply anymore. Not the rules of the army, not the rules of God, not even the rules you once made for yourself. That night, the rope finally broke. I remember her silhouette against the dim light of a kerosene lamp. She was young, too young. Her clothes were damp from the rain, clinging to her skin. Her eyes, those eyes, they burned into me with something I mistook for invitation. I told myself I saw desire there. But I was wrong. What I saw was defiance. What I mistook for a sound of pleasure was the muffled cry of someone swallowing their fear and their rage. I did not hear the difference until years later, when it was far too late. That was the moment I was no longer a soldier. I became a sinner. When I look back now, I wish I could tell you there was a voice in my head that stopped me, a flash of conscience that pulled me back. But there wasn't. There was only the storm outside and the storm inside me. You might wonder why I'm telling you this. Why dig up something so shameful, something I have spent decades trying to bury? The answer is simple, because silence has been my prison, and confession, even if it's to strangers, might be the only way to step outside those walls. Every time I think about her, I remember not just the act but the look in her eyes after it was over. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared at me, unblinking, as if memorizing my face so she could carry it with her forever. That look has followed me across oceans, through marriages, jobs, and sleepless nights. It has been with me in every empty room, in every glass of whiskey, in every failed attempt to convince myself I'm not the man I know I am. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a city I've never been to, perhaps in a village I walked past without noticing, there might be a man or woman who carries my blood. My child. I don't know if they even know I exist. I don't know if they would spit in my face or turn away in disgust if we ever met. But I do know this. They are the one innocent thing that came from the worst night of my life. War leaves behind scars you can't see. The medals they give you don't cover them. The parades don't erase them. And the years don't heal them. They just teach you how to hide them better. Until one day you can't hide them anymore. And that day, is today. I wish I could tell you the night it happened was an exception, a break in an otherwise honorable record. But the truth is, by that point, the line between who I was before the war and who I had become was already blurred beyond recognition. And to understand how I got there, you need to see the place where we were stationed, the rhythm of our days, and the way the air itself seemed to teach a man to forget what he once believed. The village lay along a muddy bend of a river somewhere in the south of Vietnam. I couldn't pronounce its name then, and I still can't now. A cluster of wooden huts sat along the water's edge, their roofs patched with whatever the locals could find: rusted tin, palm leaves, bits of tarp. At dawn, the mist rolled in so thick you could barely see the opposite bank. By mid-morning, the sun would burn it away, revealing children wading in the shallows, women squatting by the banks washing clothes, and fishermen pulling in nets that seemed lighter every day. But beneath that simple, almost peaceful surface, there was a tension you could taste. The war seeped into every plank of wood, every grain of rice, every drop of water. Even when the guns were silent, you could smell it, the faint metallic tang of gunpowder clinging to the air, carried on the humid breeze from some battle miles away. Some mornings you'd hear artillery in the distance, like thunder that didn't belong to the weather. Other times it was close enough to make the ground vibrate under your boots. Our orders were simple, at least on paper: patrol the perimeter, secure the village, keep the river clear of enemy movement. But the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. They could be a shadow slipping between trees, or an old man carrying a bundle of firewood. They could be a farmer in the fields by day and a sniper by night. We learned not to trust anyone, not even the people who smiled at us, not even the kids who ran alongside the road waving. That kind of constant suspicion does something to a man. At first, you think you're just being cautious. Then, without realizing it, you stop seeing people as people. Faces become potential threats. Conversations become distractions. Every pair of eyes you meet is a question: will they kill me if they get the chance? I arrived in Vietnam in the middle of the rainy season, when the air felt like it was pressing down on you and the ground never dried. I was 24, still clinging to the idea that if I did my job well, I could go home with my head held high. That was before the first ambush, before I saw a friend of mine, a kid from Ohio who liked to talk about fishing, get blown apart by a mine hidden in the road. After that, something in me shifted. I told myself it was just part of surviving. But survival has its own cost. The days blurred together. Patrol, eat, clean your rifle, try to sleep, wake up to the sound of gunfire. We moved like clockwork, but the tension never let up. A trip to the village market might end in small talk with a vendor, or in a grenade tossed into your path. You never knew which. After a while, it became easier not to care, not about the people, not about their stories, not about their pain. Caring got in the way. Caring could get you killed. There was a stretch of weeks when we lost someone every other day. Sometimes it was in a firefight, sometimes it was an accident. I learned to stop asking why, and start asking, how soon can we move on? Grief was a luxury we couldn't afford. If you stopped to mourn, you fell behind. And falling behind could mean your own death. It was during those months that the edges of my conscience began to fray. The orders came down and we followed them. Sometimes that meant burning a hut we suspected of harboring weapons. Sometimes it meant interrogating someone who didn't speak a word of English. Sometimes it meant turning away when another soldier crossed the line, because tomorrow you'd need him to watch your back. The truth is, you can't swim in a river of mud and expect to come out clean. I think now about the younger version of myself. The boy who went to church on Sundays, who held doors open for strangers, who believed the rules of right and wrong were as solid as stone. That boy didn't survive Vietnam. By the time the incident with her happened, I was someone else entirely. One evening, during a rare quiet spell, I sat on an overturned ammo crate, cleaning my rifle as the sun went down. The light caught the smoke rising from the village cooking fires, turning it gold. Somewhere, a radio played a song in Vietnamese I couldn't understand. I watched the villagers move about their routines, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. But that's the trick of war. It can look ordinary right before it turns on you. In war, the line between right and wrong is as thin as a strand of hair. You tell yourself you're holding the line, but each day it shifts under your feet, and you don't notice until it's gone. Our squad leader, a grizzled sergeant who'd been in country longer than anyone, used to say, "If you're looking for morality out here, you're in the wrong business." At the time I laughed it off. Now I realize he wasn't joking. The village itself had a rhythm we came to know. Market days, fishing days, the quiet lulls when the elders gathered under the big tamarind tree. But it also had secrets. There were trails leading out into the jungle that seemed to appear overnight, caches of supplies hidden in plain sight, whispers you couldn't quite catch. Every so often the army would sweep through, searching for weapons or explosives. Sometimes we found them. Sometimes we didn't. But the distrust lingered. I can still picture the faces of the children there, wide-eyed, curious, sometimes laughing, sometimes too solemn for their age. One boy in particular used to stand at the edge of the road watching us pass. He never waved, never smiled. Just stood there as if trying to memorize us. I often wonder if he was watching for the same reason she did later on, to remember. The longer we stayed, the more the lines blurred. The uniform became less about honor and more about survival. The rifle became less about defense and more about dominance. And me. I became less about who I was and more about what I could endure. Looking back, the village was more than just a place on the map. It was a slow, steady pressure, reshaping me into someone I didn't recognize. Every patrol, every checkpoint, every shadow in the treeline chipped away at the man I thought I was. Until one night, when the storm outside met the storm inside and I crossed the line completely. War has a way of storing its worst moments for nights when you think you might finally get some rest. That night was one of them. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, a steady curtain that turned the dirt paths into slick, sucking mud. We had just returned from a sweep through the jungle, a mission meant to flush out a suspected enemy position on the other side of the river. The firefight had been brief but brutal. 2 of our guys were wounded. The rest of us were soaked, caked in mud, and exhausted in a way that made every movement feel heavier than it should. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, smoke, and cordite. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like a warning that the war was still awake, even if we were trying to sleep. I remember thinking I just wanted to lie down, close my eyes, and let the rain drown out everything else. We were moving back through the edge of the village when I saw her. The house was barely more than a shack, 4 wooden walls, a sagging roof patched with palm leaves, and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Light from a kerosene lamp spilled through the cracks, flickering in the rain. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the sound, not a voice, not exactly, but movement inside. Maybe it was the way the lamplight caught the outline of someone's figure. I pushed the door open. She was standing near a small table, wearing a dress that clung to her from the rain. Her hair was damp, strands stuck to her face. She froze when she saw me. For a long second, neither of us moved. I remember the sound of the rain hammering the roof, the smell of damp wood, the way the shadows seemed to press in around us. Her eyes were what I noticed most, wide, unblinking, locked on mine. There was fear there, no doubt. But there was something else too, or at least I thought there was. At the time, I told myself it was an invitation, a silent permission. I told myself that in a place like this, in a time like this, maybe she was looking for comfort, for connection, even if it came from a stranger in a uniform. But that was the story I invented for myself. She didn't speak. She didn't step back, but she didn't come closer either. The air between us was thick enough to cut. I took a step forward. She didn't move. I took another. Her hands were at her sides, fingers twitching as if she wasn't sure whether to reach for something or keep them still. I don't remember exactly when I closed the distance, only that I could feel the heat of her body, could smell the faint scent of rain and smoke on her skin. My hands were on her arms. She tensed, I felt it, but I ignored it. I told myself it was hesitation, not resistance. When I kissed her, she turned her head slightly, just enough to make me chase her lips. My grip tightened. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows that made the room feel smaller, more closed in. The rain outside grew louder, or maybe my breathing did. She made a sound, low, muffled. I thought it was a gasp of desire. I thought it was agreement. But it wasn't. I know that now. Back then, I didn't care enough to know the difference. Her body was rigid beneath mine, but I told myself it was because of the cold, because of the rain. I pressed harder, hands finding their way under wet fabric, skin warm against my palms. She made another sound, sharper this time, almost a whimper. Still, I told myself it was something else. Something I wanted to hear. I mistook the moan of fear for the moan of desire, a mistake that can never be undone. The rest happened quickly and slowly all at once. My mind remembers flashes, the way the lamp's light caught the edge of her jaw, the taste of rainwater on her skin, the moment her hands pushed weakly at my chest. I didn't stop. I didn't even think of stopping. When it was over, I stepped back. She adjusted her dress without looking at me. The rain still pounded on the roof, a steady, merciless rhythm. She finally looked up, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't what I had convinced myself of at the start. It was pure, unfiltered hatred, cold enough to make the air between us feel like ice. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stared at me as if memorizing every line of my face, every detail of the man she would remember for the rest of her life. I felt something then, not guilt, not yet, but the unsettling awareness that I had crossed into a place I couldn't return from. I left without saying a word. My boots sank into the mud as I walked back into the rain. The darkness of the village seemed to swallow me whole. Behind me, the light from her shack flickered once, then went out. That night, I lay on my cot, listening to the rain. My hands still smelled faintly of her skin. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that she would forget, that I would forget. But even as I closed my eyes, I knew neither of those things was true. In war, we commit acts we later justify in the language of survival. We tell ourselves it was the fog of war, the heat of the moment, the blur between enemy and ally. But some acts don't fit into those excuses. Some acts follow you home, into your dreams, into your quiet moments, into the parts of your life that have nothing to do with war, until you realize they are the war and you never left it. That night became my war. And it has never ended. The rain eventually stopped, but the war didn't. It just shifted, quieting into rumors and paperwork, into the strange, tense silence that comes when everyone knows the end is near but no one trusts it. It was the final weeks before the ceasefire. Word was spreading through the camp that the Paris Peace Accords were about to be signed. Our orders had already come down. We'd be pulling out soon, leaving this place to the South Vietnamese forces. Some men celebrated. Others drank until they couldn't stand. I didn't feel much of anything, just a dull ache in my chest that had nothing to do with the war itself, and everything to do with a night I could never take back. The village seemed different in those last days. The kids didn't run to greet us anymore. The market stalls looked thinner, as if everyone was keeping their best goods hidden away. The river, swollen from weeks of rain, moved sluggishly under a gray sky. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath. I spent most of my time in the motor pool, pretending to work on equipment that didn't need fixing. It kept me away from the barracks, away from the conversations about going home, about wives and girlfriends waiting back in the States. I didn't have the heart for those talks. I didn't have the right. The day before we were scheduled to leave, I was sitting on a crate outside the mess tent, smoking a cigarette I didn't really want, when Jackson walked up. He was one of the few men I'd come to trust, tall, wiry, with a grin that usually meant trouble. But that day he wasn't grinning. He sat down beside me, elbows on his knees, looking out at the road that led toward the village. For a while he didn't say anything. Then he asked, almost casually, "You ever think about what you're leaving behind?" I shrugged. Not much to think about. He flicked his cigarette into the mud. That's not what I heard. I turned to look at him, and he was watching me in that careful way soldiers do when they're not sure if they're crossing a line. "What the hell's that supposed to mean?" He hesitated, then said it. "I heard you might have left something here. A kid." The words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. I felt my stomach drop, my throat tighten. My first instinct was to laugh it off, tell him he was full of shit. But I didn't. I couldn't. My mind went straight to her face, those eyes, that unblinking stare, and the possibility that somewhere in this village, there was a child with my blood in their veins. Jackson must have seen the change in my expression because he didn't push it. "Just something I heard," he said, standing up, brushing the dirt from his pants. "Figured you'd want to know." I watched him walk away, the mud sucking at his boots, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the camp settling into its final night here. The idea kept circling in my head. A child. My child. The timelines lined up. It was possible. More than possible. And if it was true, what did that make me? Not just a soldier who'd crossed a line, but a father who'd abandoned his own flesh and blood before they'd even taken their first breath. I thought about going into the village, about finding her, about demanding to know if it was true. But what right did I have to ask? What right did I have to know? If she hated me, and God knows she had reason to, why would she ever let me near the child? The more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth: she wouldn't. And maybe she shouldn't. By morning, the camp was buzzing with the news that the ceasefire would be official within days. Trucks were being loaded, crates nailed shut. The air was thick with anticipation, relief, and something else, a quiet fear of what came after. Men who'd been counting the days suddenly seemed reluctant to let go, as if leaving this place meant acknowledging the things they couldn't change. As for me, I felt like I was walking toward a different kind of battlefield. In that moment, I understood that the war wasn't ending for me, it was only beginning in another form. When the convoy rolled out, I kept my eyes on the road ahead. But every time we passed a cluster of houses, I couldn't stop scanning for her. For a glimpse of a face in a doorway, a child's figure by the river. I didn't see her. I didn't see anyone I recognized. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she saw me, that somewhere, hidden from view, she was watching me leave, making sure I was gone for good. We crossed the last bridge out of the province just as the sun broke through the clouds. The men in the truck with me cheered, some even sang. I stayed quiet, my hands gripping my rifle, my mind miles behind us, in a village I would never forget. The flight home was supposed to be the end. But it wasn't. I remember the moment the wheels touched down on American soil. People on the plane clapped. Some cheered. I just stared out the window, watching the tarmac blur past, feeling like I had left something unfinished half a world away, something that was now following me home. At first, it was the nights that got to me. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, ears filled with the sound of rotor blades cutting the air. Sometimes I'd hear the crack of distant gunfire. Other times, it was softer, the sound of rain on a tin roof, or the cry of a child I couldn't see. I'd sit up in bed, convinced for a moment that I was back in that village, standing in the doorway of that shack, staring into her eyes again. Sleep stopped being a refuge and became another battlefield. I learned to fear the dark. I started leaving the TV on at night, the drone of late-night shows keeping me from sinking too deep into my own head. But nothing worked for long. The dreams always found me. I tried to build a life. I married within a year of coming home, took a job in construction. For a while, I thought maybe I could bury the past under the weight of routine. But the cracks showed quickly. I'd lose my temper over nothing. A car backfiring would send me to the ground before I even realized I'd moved. Crowds made me feel cornered. And whenever I heard a baby cry, I froze, not out of annoyance but because it felt like the sound was aimed directly at me. My wife tried to understand. She asked about the war, about what I'd seen, what I'd done. I gave her the sanitized version, the kind you could tell at a family barbecue. I never told her about the night in the rain. But she knew something was missing, something I wasn't saying. Eventually she stopped asking. We divorced after 5 years. No kids. I told myself it was better that way. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, kept to myself. I worked when I could, drank when I couldn't. The days bled together in the same way they had in Vietnam, one indistinguishable from the next. The doctors called it PTSD. They gave me pills, told me to talk about my feelings. But it wasn't just the nightmares or the jumpiness. It was deeper than that. It was the sense that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, that the man I'd been before the war was gone, and the man who came back didn't deserve the life he was trying to rebuild. They call it moral injury, when the wound isn't to your body or even your mind but to your very sense of self. You stop believing in your own goodness. You stop trusting your own judgment. Every mirror becomes an accusation. I no longer believed I was worthy of forgiveness. And it wasn't just about her, or about the possibility of a child I'd never know. It was about the way I'd let myself become someone who could do that in the first place. I'd gone to war believing I was the kind of man who could draw a line, who could say, this far, no further. And then, in one night, I proved myself wrong. Years passed, but the weight didn't lessen. I avoided reunions with my old unit. I ignored letters from veterans groups. I couldn't bear the thought of standing in a room with men who might remember me, or worse, men who might not, because what I did didn't even register to them as out of the ordinary. That thought scared me most of all. Some nights, I'd find myself driving aimlessly, ending up at the edge of the ocean. I'd sit there for hours watching the tide come in, wondering if the waves looked anything like the Mekong in the rain. I'd imagine her standing on the opposite shore, holding the hand of a boy or girl with my eyes, my hair. I'd wonder if they ever asked about me, if she told them the truth, if she even spoke my name. I told myself I should try to find them, that maybe I could make it right somehow. But every time the thought got close to becoming action, I stopped. Not out of fear of rejection, but because deep down, I didn't believe I deserved the chance. That's the thing about moral injury, it doesn't heal with time. You can't drink it away, can't talk it out of existence. It lives with you, reshaping every thought, every choice. You start to see yourself not as someone who made a mistake, but as the mistake itself. And when you reach that point, there's no going back. It took me nearly 10 years to work up the courage to go back. By then, the war was something you read about in history books, but for me it was still right there, in the rain, in the smell of damp earth, in the sound of a child's cry that came from nowhere. I told people I was going back for closure, but the truth was I didn't even know what that meant. I just knew I had to see for myself if the story Jackson had told me was real. The first trip was clumsy. I had no plan, no contacts, just an old map and a memory that had been fraying at the edges for years. The village had changed. The dirt road leading in was now paved, lined with stalls selling fruit and cigarettes. Kids rode bicycles past me without a second glance. I walked to where I thought her shack had been, but there was a concrete house there now, painted bright blue, with laundry fluttering in the yard. A woman in her 40s came to the door. She didn't recognize me. She said she'd lived there for 15 years. I asked about the family who had been there before. She shook her head, said they moved away long ago, didn't know where. Her tone wasn't unfriendly, but it was final. The kind of answer that closed a door in your face without slamming it. I tried the local government office next. The clerk, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a patient smile, told me records from the war years were incomplete. When I pressed, he leaned closer and lowered his voice, telling me that many such records had been lost, destroyed, or simply never kept. "You understand?" he said, and I did. In a place torn apart by war, paperwork was the first casualty. Over the next few years, I made more trips. Each time, I thought I'd learned enough to do it better. I asked questions in tea shops, in markets, at the ferry crossing on the river. I visited orphanages, some still standing from the war, others built later. I would sit with the directors, showing them my faded photographs, asking if any child had come through with eyes like mine. They were always kind, but the answer was always the same: no. It was as if she and the child had vanished into thin air. On my third trip, I met an old man by the river. He sat on a low stool, mending a fishing net, his hands moving with the patience of someone who had been doing it his whole life. When I asked him if he remembered a young woman from the war years, his eyes narrowed. He didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Some people, they don't want to be found." I tried to ask more, but he shook his head and went back to his net. That sentence stayed with me. It was the first time I realized she might have made a deliberate choice, not just to leave but to erase herself from anywhere I could look. Every visit to Vietnam became a ritual. I'd start in Saigon, take the bus south, watch the scenery change. Rice paddies, small towns, roadside shrines. I'd stop at the same roadside cafe halfway down the route. The owner, a woman with silver hair, eventually learned my order: strong coffee, no sugar. She never asked why I kept coming back. When I reached the province, I'd walk the same streets, sit by the same riverbank where our patrols used to pass. I'd try to imagine her walking there, holding the hand of a child. I'd imagine what they'd look like now, a teenager on my first trip back, a grown adult by the last. Each trip was another time I clawed at a wound that had never healed. The hardest part wasn't the dead ends. It was the moments when I thought I might be close. Once, I saw a young man at the market, tall, with light brown hair and green eyes that stood out against the crowd. My heart nearly stopped. I followed him through the stalls, my hands shaking. When he finally turned to face me, I saw it wasn't him. Couldn't be. He smiled politely before disappearing into the crowd, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Another time, a woman at an orphanage told me she remembered a child who might match what I described. She went to check the old files only to come back shaking her head. "That one was adopted," she said. "American family. Long time ago. No names, no contact. Another ghost trail." By the sixth trip, I started to realize I wasn't searching for them anymore. I was searching for some kind of punishment. Every unanswered question, every locked door, every "I don't know," was a confirmation that I deserved exactly what I was getting: nothing. And yet I kept coming back. The last time I returned, I stood on the same bridge we'd crossed in the convoy that final day of the war. The river moved slowly beneath me, brown and restless. I tried to picture her somewhere upstream, maybe in another village, maybe far away, looking out over the same water. I wondered if she ever thought of me, not with forgiveness but with the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from knowing you've denied someone the one thing they want most. When I left that time, I didn't tell myself it was the end. I just knew that even if I came back 100 more times, the result would be the same. She was gone. The child was gone. And all I was left with was the echo of their absence. I had almost convinced myself to stop searching when the past found me first. It happened at a veterans gathering I hadn't planned to attend. A buddy from my old unit had called, saying it would be good to see familiar faces. I almost said no, but something, maybe guilt, maybe loneliness, made me show up. The hall was crowded with men older, grayer, heavier than I remembered. Some walked with canes, others in wheelchairs. We swapped the usual stories, the kind that edit out the worst parts. Then I saw him, Turner. He'd been in country the same year I was, though in a different platoon. We hadn't spoken in decades. He spotted me across the room and made his way over, a slow, deliberate walk like each step was weighed. After a few pleasantries, he leaned in, voice low. "You ever go back there?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "A few times." "Looking for her?" The question caught me off guard. I didn't need to ask who he met. "You know about that?" Turner nodded. His eyes were steady, but there was no judgment in them. "I heard something. Back then." He glanced around, then continued. "There was talk that after you left, she said she'd take back everything from the man who hurt her. Every last thing." My mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" "Could mean a lot of things," he said. "But I think it means she was gonna make sure you never got what you wanted most." I thought about that for a long moment. "You think she hid the kid?" Maybe. Or maybe she sent them somewhere you'd never find. Overseas. Adoption. Hell, could be there right there in that village and you'd never know it. Point is, he looked me dead in the eye. She didn't want you to have them. Ever. The words settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. All those years I'd been chasing a ghost, maybe she'd been making sure that's all I'd ever chase. I left the gathering early, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I replayed every trip to Vietnam, every dead end, every almost encounter, now through this new lens. It was never bad luck. It was design. If Turner was right, she'd planned it from the start. The night I crossed that line, she decided the rest of my life for me. She couldn't undo what I'd done, but she could make sure I lived with it in the one way that hurt most, by denying me closure. Maybe her revenge wasn't blood, but letting me live my whole life in doubt. It was cruel. And it was brilliant. Because doubt is a wound you can't stop touching. It never scabs over, never heals. You keep picking at it because maybe, just maybe, the next time you'll find the answer. And you never do. In the weeks after that conversation, I tried to see it from her side. She'd been young, alone in a war zone, stripped of choice, of dignity. I'd taken something from her she could never get back. But she'd found a way to take something from me too, my peace. And in some twisted way, maybe that leveled the field. I started to think about the child differently too. Not just as someone I'd lost, but as someone she'd protected from me. That was the hardest part to swallow. Because if I was honest, I couldn't guarantee I'd have been a good father. Not with the man I'd been then. Maybe not with the man I am now. Turner and I kept in touch after that night. Once, I asked him if he thought she hated me enough to keep it going all these years. He just said, hate fades. But making a point? That can last forever. I don't know if I believe him. I think hate can be the most enduring thing in the world, especially when it's fed by memory. But either way, the result was the same, she'd won. And I was left standing in the wreckage, not even sure which parts I'd built myself. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't set you free. Sometimes it locks the door and swallows the key. It took me years to admit it, but I see it clearly now. The greatest revenge wasn't hiding the child. It wasn't disappearing without a trace. It was making sure I would never know the truth. Every possible version of the story exists in my head, and none of them can be proven. That's the genius of it. You can't fight an enemy you can't see, and you can't heal a wound that keeps changing shape. I used to think that if I just found an answer, yes or no, alive or gone, I could finally set it down. But the truth is, I don't think I'd know what to do with certainty if I had it. Doubt became my constant companion, my shadow. Take it away and I wouldn't even know who I was anymore. Over the years, I met other veterans who carried their own invisible weights. Some had killed civilians by mistake. Others had walked away from a buddy bleeding out because orders told them to. They talked about the noise, the nightmares, the drinking. But the ones who looked the most hollow were the ones who'd done something that broke their own code. They weren't haunted by what had been done to them, they were haunted by what they'd done themselves. That's the thing about moral injury, it's not an open wound you can stitch shut. It's more like rust. It spreads quietly, eating away at the parts of you that used to feel solid, until one day you realize there's nothing holding you up anymore. I've seen men survive bullets, shrapnel, even years in prison camps, and still find a way to live decent lives afterward. But the ones carrying moral injury? They're the ones who seem to fade year after year, until they're little more than a shell. In war, the bullet isn't the only thing that kills a man. And in my case, it wasn't a bullet at all. It was a choice I made one night in the rain. A choice I told myself was temporary, that it wouldn't follow me home. But it did. It followed me through every year, every relationship, every sleepless night. Sometimes I wonder if she knew exactly how deep it would go. If she understood that by leaving me with uncertainty, she was leaving me with no way out. If so, then I have to admit, she won. And in a way, she won without lifting another finger after that night. There's a strange sort of respect in that. Not forgiveness. Never forgiveness. but respect for someone who could take the worst thing that happened to them and turn it into a weapon they could use for the rest of their life. I'll never know where she went. I'll never know if the child was real. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Because certainty would end the sentence and doubt keeps it running forever. In the end, all that's left is the telling. For years I carried this story like a locked box. I was afraid that if I opened it, the stench of it would drive people away for good. Maybe it still will. But there comes a point when silence feels like another kind of cowardice. So this is my confession, to her, to the child, wherever they are, if they even are. I don't expect them to hear it. I don't expect them to care if they do. This is not a plea for forgiveness. It's a record. A marker left behind in the hope that, somewhere down the line, it keeps someone from stepping where I stepped. I tell it not to be forgiven, but so no one else repeats me. I was 22 when I made the worst decision of my life. I could blame the war, the fear, the numbness that had taken root in me. I could talk about the friends I'd lost, the orders we followed, the dehumanizing grind of patrol after patrol. And maybe all of that is true. But none of it erases the fact that I crossed a line no man should cross. If the child exists, I have no right to call myself their father. A father is someone you can trust to protect you, to put your needs above his own. I did the opposite before they were even born. If anything, I hope they were raised far from me, far from the shadow I've carried. I think about the woman more often than I admit. Sometimes I see her in my mind as she was that night, rain in her hair, defiance in her eyes. Other times I imagine her older, stronger, living a life built in spite of me. In both versions she wins. War sells itself as honor, as service, as sacrifice. But the real cost isn't the medals or the scars you can see. It's the parts of yourself you lose without realizing, until you wake up one day and find there's nothing left but a shell and a shadow. That's why I'm speaking now. Because somewhere, some young man is being told that war will make him a man, that the uniform will give him purpose. He doesn't know that it can also strip him bare, and that the wrong choice on the wrong night can follow him farther than any bullet ever could. If telling this spares one person from carrying what I carry, then maybe there's some use left in me after all. To the woman, I can't give you back what I took. I can't rewrite that night. All I can do is acknowledge it, name it for what it was, and accept the weight it put on both of us. To the child, if you exist, you owe me nothing. Not recognition. Not contact. Not forgiveness. Your life is your own, and I hope it's been one worth living. And to whoever hears this, remember that in war, the wounds you can't see are the ones that last the longest. They don't make movies about moral injury because it's not dramatic enough for the screen. But it's the quiet kind of damage that shapes the rest of a life. I don't know how much longer I have. Time is short and the body slows down. But before I go, I wanted this truth in the world, even if it's only a whisper in the noise. Because in the end, silence helps no one. In the quiet after the telling, I found myself back at the river. It looked different now, the banks reinforced with concrete, small shops on the far side selling tea and cigarettes, but the current was the same. Slow, brown, carrying the weight of years without ever stopping. I leaned on the railing and let the humid air settle into my bones. I tried to picture the child now grown. Maybe they stand like me, leaning on some railing half a world away. Maybe they have my eyes. Or maybe they look nothing like me at all because the only thing we share is a shadow neither of us asked for. The water moved beneath me, the same water that had reflected the smoke of gunfire and the red of the setting sun on the day I left. Back then, I thought I was leaving it all behind. Now I know better. Some things follow you whether you want them to or not. And then, in the fading light, I remembered her face. Not the imagined older version, but as she was that night. Wet hair clinging to her cheeks. Eyes locked on mine with a mixture of fury and something deeper, sharper. I used to think it was fear. Now I know it was a promise. There are some eyes that follow you for the rest of your life. I closed mine and still saw them. Even here, decades later, with the noise of scooters in the distance and the chatter of the tea shop behind me, those eyes were closer than anything else. Not accusing. Not forgiving. just there. I pushed away from the railing and started walking. The night market was beginning to light up, voices rising with the scent of grilled meat. Life moved forward around me, indifferent to what I carried. And maybe that's how it should be. But if you've listened this far, I want something from you. Not forgiveness, I've learned to stop asking for that, but attention. Think about what you've heard. Think about the choices you make and the ones you can't take back. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. If you have your own story, tell it. And if you believe in hearing more of the truths that don't make it into the history books, subscribe, because there are more voices like mine that deserve to be heard. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. Sometimes it never ends at all.